A cordial welcome on my part to today's talk entitled Beyond the Buzzwords, Geopolitics and Strategic Communications. For those of you who have been in the room for a while, it is very, very rare that our staff has to add chairs, and so I'm very, very happy that so many of you came. Partly I expected that. I think it's going to be a great talk. Partly I learned something else. So buzzwords, they always work. They work with students, with the interested public. So for instance, if you entitle a master's course here, Geopolitics, then lots and lots of students are going to flock there. They will find that very interesting. Today we are talking about these buzzwords. Yeah. So I'm learning, talking about the buzzwords is also something that is very appealing to you. It's definitely also something that is of great interest for me in my research because it is about the juncture of international relations and communication ultimately. And a lot of things that happen in international politics actually are about communication, for better or for worse. Yeah. So we've seen quite a spectacle 2 days ago about this communication with all its repercussions for international politics. But that perhaps we can talk about in the questions and answers. So for the time being, it's a pleasure for me to introduce you to today's speaker. That is Dr. Leonie Haiden. She is from the policy planning staff at the Austrian Foreign Ministry. They, by the way, do really, really interesting things. So they really think about strategy. They really think ahead and the moves that others may make. There's definitely a very, very interesting and very important work that Leonie does there. She is, though, not only a practitioner, but she's definitely also a scholar. So she's both. She has a doctorate from King's College in London, where she wrote on metaphors and grand strategy, because containment, what she wrote about, is actually also a metaphor, and it's obviously something that really shaped world politics for quite a while. Arguably, it still does. And so without any further ado, let's give her a big round of applause and hand the word over to her.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here, and welcome to everyone joining on the live stream as well. And thank you to Markus for giving me the opportunity to speak at the Diplomatic Academy. It is a privilege and a pleasure. So, briefly about myself, I'm currently in the policy planning staff, but I was born and raised in Austria, but spent most of my adult life in the UK, first studying English literature at the University of Oxford, and then going to the War Studies department at King's College, where I studied non-proliferation and strategic communications. And it was really at King's College in the War Studies department that I started thinking about the relationship between geopolitics and communication, both through my doctoral research, but also by developing and teaching the MA master's program in strategic communications there. So then, for about 3 years ago, I returned to Austria and am now at the policy planning staff. And a disclaimer right away, I'm here purely in my private capacity and do not speak on behalf of the Foreign Ministry. So, why strategic communications and geopolitics? So let's start with geopolitics. One of the things we work on in the policy planning staff is monitoring the foreign policy discourse. We analyze think tank publications and new academic studies. And this mapping you see here gives an overview of all the different topics we've worked on throughout the past 3 years. So everything from new flashpoints to superpower competition, a more assertive middle powers, technological transformations, and then megatrends like demographic shifts. But overarching all these different challenges is a bigger shift. And I want you all to think back to around 2019, 2020. At that point, climate change and the effects of climate change were really top of mind. So remembering the Fridays for Future protests, Extinction Rebellion in London, preventing me from getting to King's College easily because they were literally in Trafalgar Square. And then, of course, the launching of EU's Green New Deal. And today, climate change really is only one of various challenges we face. And starting before, but of course intensifying with the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the focus has really shifted to security and defense. And this is reflected in increased military budgets, calls for decoupling and strategic autonomy in the economic realm, and also building societal resilience against foreign interference. And the underlying mood or zeitgeist has also shifted, and I think this is illustrated really nicely with these different covers from Foreign Affairs. The world is much more divided, uncertain, fractured, and menacing, and even the color scheme has gone to kind of blacks and reds, so a much more frightening environment, essentially, uncertain one as well. So we find ourselves now at a really interesting point, and it's kind of been declared the end of the post-Cold War era. So for 30 years since the end of the Cold War, we basically defined that time by Fukuyama's The End of History, victory of liberal democracy over communism and authoritarianism, and an accelerated globalization and interconnection of the world. And pundits, analysts, and politicians are now kind of trying to find an adequate way of capturing what that new era is. So two terms that have arisen are permacrisis and polycrisis. They were even made words of the year by various dictionaries in 22 and 23. And we've also seen the resurgence of familiar metaphors like New Cold War or Cold War 2.0, and they've really experienced the revival as we're trying to describe this intensified systemic competition between China and the US. But both these approaches, so the polycrisis and that's called the New Cold War, have fallen short of truly generating new and kind of sticky framings for the times we live in, and also to suggest where we are going next. So thinking especially about a frame that could unite us within national societies and also globally to deal with all these transformations and challenges that we face. And I believe this is in part, so the struggle to find adequate frames, find adequate words to describe this era is because liberal democracies, they're not just challenged on a geopolitical level, but they're also challenged on the level of narratives. And what has emerged here as a central concern is basically how to defend, but ideally project, liberal democratic values and the rules-based international order in this post-Cold War era. And doing that in a way that is sensitive to legitimate concerns, but also, and more inclusive to calls for participation in the international system and maybe reformations of it, but also confident and steadfast when we face those forces that seek to undermine our way of life. And so here I would really recommend a new book by three scholars in international relations called Debating Worlds, and it's an edited volume, and it really speaks to these different contesting narratives. And this list is based on the book, but also some things I've added into that. And I think it gives a good overview of where we are at on a narrative level and kind of all these different challenging narratives that we're dealing with. So to quickly go through it, we've got China with a new global narrative that emphasizes grievance and revision, and which they're very actively pushing in international fora and through the Belt and Road Initiative, for example. Russia's anti-American, anti-Western narrative around the idea that might makes right, as seen through their invasion of Ukraine, and also a sense of relativism and whataboutism. We've got the BRICS countries calling for a narrative of global transformation and a potential multipolar system. And we've still got the climate change narratives as well, of course, so the idea of global endangerment, global dystopia. And as is very much top of mind, President Trump's America First policy and really emphasis on transactional international relations rather than multilateral modes of doing politics. And finally, and adding to that, within Western societies, we've also got this crisis of confidence in the liberal democratic narrative and growing appeals of inward-looking populism and strongman politics. So now we've kind of set the scene. We've talked a lot about challenges, talked a lot about the problems we face. So where can we start looking for solutions, or how can we better understand and navigate this environment? And I will not argue that strategic communication is the answer to all these problems, but I do think that we cannot fully understand geopolitics in the 21st century without it, because strategic communication is unique in merging geopolitics, influence, and communications, and it seeks to combine the macro level of politics, the global, with the micro level, so all the way down to the individual and how they respond to information and how they make sense of the world around them. So at this point, you're probably asking, what is strategic communications and where does it come from? So there are several possible origins for looking at kind of where strategic communications developed, but it's really this crisis of confidence in liberal democracy and international institutions. And that laid the ground for this desire to really tell the story of liberal democracy and liberal values better. So in a way, it's no surprise that probably the first occurrence of strategic communications in the political lexicon was in a report commissioned by the UN Secretary General Kofi Annan in 1997, where he asked how to rebuild trust and credibility in the United Nations following the failures of the UN to act and prevent humanitarian disasters in Somalia, Rwanda, and Bosnia. And what this report basically proposed, and here we already see kind of the first starts of strategic communications thinking, was the idea of strategic communication should really be at the top level of decision making. So communication should be integrated into policy making. It should be more proactive. You shouldn't wait to be asked as an institution about an issue and then explain it, but kind of explain yourself preemptively. And the idea of combining previously separate spheres in communication, so public information, press relations, and also constituency building. Another strand of development which we can look at to trace the development of strategic communications is in NATO. So here, the term strategic communications really picked up after the Russian invasion of Crimea, and the sense that this was a very sophisticated use of hybrid tactics, so the combination of kinetic force and information operations, and that there was a need within NATO countries to also professionalize and targets communications in a much more coherent and systematic way. And so the NATO Stratcom Center of Excellence was established in 2014, and strategic communications even became part of military doctrine in 2017 within NATO. So there are dozens of definitions for strategic communications, as you can imagine. They are all contested. This is a very young field, and academics and practitioners are continually debating and rethinking what it is and what it means. But what I would like to introduce to you tonight is really a strand of thinking that developed out of King's College in the War Studies department. We were part of a group of academics in the late 2010s, all from different interdisciplinary backgrounds, but in constant exchange with strategic communications practitioners, both in government, but also in the private sector. And we try to conceptualize strategic communications as a mindset to make sense of geopolitics in an age of hyper-connected and multi-directional communications. So the definition you see here is based on the work of a working group at the NATO Center, a terminology working group which met over several years and basically just debated the meaning of words. And strategic communications, of course, within this whole terminology around strategic communications was the central concern. And so the definition is based on that, and it, I believe, captures four very important aspects of what strategic communications is. So first, a holistic approach to communication. So this means that it's the understanding that everything we do communicates: words, actions, images, and non-actions. And not just when we communicate intentionally. So it's really about closing the say-do gap. We can't say one thing and do another. It has to be aligned. So that's one basic principle of strategic communications. Then the second being based on values and interests that seek to achieve objectives, seek to achieve overall objectives. And here it is really the intention to change attitudes or behaviors in pursuit of high-level strategic and value-based goals over the long term. So this is communications with a plan. It's not just reactive communications, it's communications that thinks ahead. And we can discuss the difference between planning and strategy later. But again, it's knowing your environment and adapting to it, but not letting go of that end goal that you want to achieve. Third, it's shaping key discourses. And so this is about shaping and shifting discourses in society. And this includes things like framing, metaphor, narratives, and creating a kind of common sense understanding around it. And Markus mentioned my PhD work on containment. And an example there was really how containment was a metaphor in US Cold War communications, also towards the population within the US, and that created a common sense around supporting a very precarious nuclear arms race, for example. And so finally, and this is really crucial to strategic communications, it takes place in a contested environment, so a multi-directional discursive environment that is open to different opinions and worldviews. And according to strategic communications, it all starts with understanding one's audience. You cannot effectively communicate without that. Being aware of pre-existing networks of key stakeholders, of influencers within it, pre-existing emotions and grievances potentially as well. So this final part really speaks to the shift in communication we've observed in the past 20 years that has kind of swept over the globe. And we can think about that with these kind of 4 words. So access, it's much cheaper to communicate than it was before. Speed, it's much faster. Scale, we can communicate at the push of a button with potentially millions, and we can also create content now with the help of AI, super fast, super quickly, and at scale. And then reach, there are now, I looked this up, around 4.6 billion smartphone users in the world, so just we're connected in this global space. But perhaps a more colorful way to look at this is through 2 different metaphors for communication. So in the first metaphor, think of communications kind of like a traffic system. And messages are like cars. There are clear directions. Roads don't suddenly shift around. They stay in their place. It's predictable. It's based on rules. And in broad strokes, this is how we can understand legacy media like newspaper, television, radio. These media are curated and programmed. There are publishing rules, and the communication is mostly one-to-many. We can write letters to the editor, but usually it's one-to-many, and it's predictable. We know when the morning paper arrives, and we also know when the evening newscast starts. Again, this is in broad strokes. It's also hierarchically organized. And then the second metaphor, which is really the way that strategic communications would understand the current information environment. And I'm curious whether any of you know what this is. Yeah? Sorry? It's slime mold, which technically is not a fungus, but it kind of behaves a bit like it. So it is this extremely intelligent organism that is made up of a network of networks, and it communicates through little molecules and is constantly changing shape and shifting around, reacting to its environment. So this is thinking about communications really as a network of networks, of there being a constant buzz of many-to-many communications, and messages do not travel in straight lines and not with predictable or intended effects, potentially. And there are phenomena in a system like that, like tipping points or emergence. So a simple example would be someone posts a ridiculous video of a cat and suddenly it goes viral and we can't really explain why. At some point there's a threshold that is passed because enough people share it. So small effects can have big consequences. So this complexity and really embracing this complexity is part of strategic communications, and it's getting comfortable with that complexity and in a way expecting the unexpected. So yes, we like colorful metaphors in strategic communications, but we are also built on existing theories and approaches. And I want to give you a sense of what the roots of this young field are with some of the foundations here. And I don't have the scope to go into any detail with them, but I'll kind of give you the top line on each. So strategic communications has the sense that is at least based on a weak form of social constructivism. So the idea that reality is not just immutable and kind of given to us out there, but it's shaped through the way we interact with that environment, how we speak about it, and how we interact with each other as well. Communication studies, of course, and here we're based in the semiotic school, so the idea that communication is not just about sending information from A to B, but it is about meaning making, that is a kind of co-creation. The narrative theory, this essentially is about narratives being part of the human condition. We can't not tell stories. It is so deeply ingrained in human nature. And if you've read the book Sapiens, Yuval Harari really puts that, I think, gives this a lot of color. And then network theory and complexity science, which I've touched a bit on through that metaphor. And here it's the idea that society is made up of networks. Communication is a network of networks. And Manuel Castells, who wrote this big trilogy called The Information Age, his first book is really devoted to networks. So that's been highly influential in shaping strategic communications. And complexity science, and here, if you're interested in how these ideas from complexity science are transferred and applied to the social sciences, so ideas of nonlinearity, tipping points, I really recommend Global Complexity by John Urey. And finally, cognitive and behavioral science, because I mentioned before, we're really trying to connect the global level with the individual. So this is about how do individuals actually process information. And Daniel Kahneman wrote his Thinking Fast and Slow book, where he described two types of thinking, so system 1 and system 2. And when we're faced with information, it's usually system 1 that is activated first, which is kind of our intuitive knee-jerk reaction to information. It is where biases come in and mental shortcuts. And it's only the system 2, our slower way of reacting, the more deliberative side that engages with logic and reason, that is the system 2. So engaging with cognitive science and cognitive theories. So these are some of the foundations. But on top of that, strategic communications really wants to engage with what the zeitgeist is that we're living through. What are people kind of experiencing right now? What are the big shifts that are happening within societies and also the tensions we're living with? And here I just put up a selection of thinkers and kind of new studies, new books and ideas that I think can be really inspiring and helpful to navigate communications and geopolitics in this time. And the first I would mention is Andreas Reckwitz, who wrote a book called Verlust, so loss. And he writes about how the progress narrative in Western modernity has come under increased pressure as a much more pessimistic outlook has really solidified within Western societies. So the idea that my children will be worse off than myself, the future will be worse than the present, and maybe even the past was better than the present and the future. And so it's this combination of an experience of current loss, even if it is subjective, and future loss. So this is a lot of it is to do with climate change, of course, and anticipating losses to come. And he says that this is a key phenomenon to understand populism or nostalgia for the past in current society. Then the Antisocial Century, which is an article that Derek Thompson very recently published in The Atlantic. And here he talks about the fact that people just spend way less time with others. They spend way more time on their own. And that this has fundamental effects on democracy as well, because essentially through a phone-based and home-based life that many people live nowadays, we have solidified our closest connections, so family and friends, and in a way we've also intensified our connection to the globe, so networks of like-minded people, but it is kind of the inner ring of social relationships, so people who live in our neighborhood, people who live in our town, that have suffered and that we don't engage with as much. And he quotes in a researcher at Brown University, Mark Dunkelman, who argues that it is really these familiar but not intimate relationships that teach us disagreement and compromise, and that is fundamental for democracy. So again, really interesting, I think, to keep that in mind when you think about communications. And then finally, Jonathan Haidt published The Anxious Generation last year, and he drew a correlation and potential causation between the introduction of smartphones and especially kind of a childhood that is based on smartphones rather than play, and skyrocketing levels of depression, as well as weaker academic performance. And the bigger question that then poses is, we talk a lot about resilience right now, so given that we're living in this very threatening international environment, talk about resilience, but what does that do? What does a skyrocketing depression do to a population that should be able to withstand stress and also become productive and creative members of society? So kind of asking that question. So again, these transformations might seem kind of removed from geopolitics, but I think they're absolutely crucial to understanding how can we talk about politics and geopolitics with people in society who are maybe feeling these things much more strongly than kind of the top level great power politics. So before I said that strategic communications believes that everything communicates, and now I'm going to slightly caveat that by saying communication isn't everything, and the best communication can fail if it does not speak to the lived experience of just ordinary people. And this might sound counterintuitive initially, but I think that metaphor is a way of kind of avoiding that pitfall, of avoiding kind of remaining in a bubble. And so I would like to use this latter segment of my lecture to talk about metaphors and why they matter. So very quickly, why do metaphors matter? It's, again, a very relatively young field of study, and it was only in 1980 that George Lakoff and Mark Johnson published Metaphors We Live By. And in it, they basically argued that metaphors affect the way humans think and perceive the world. And they argue that metaphors have the ability to define reality and to guide future action as well. And if we repeat the same metaphor over and over again, then they can become self-fulfilling prophecies. And you might say, okay, I understand this in theory, but does this actually pan out in practice? Like, how can you prove that metaphors affect the way people think or the way people react to information or a certain policy? And I've got two studies here. I think I will only talk about the one on the right in the interest of time. But in that, two cognitive scientists did an experiment with people in the US, and they wrote two texts describing crime in a hypothetical city they called Addison. And in these two separate groups, in one group, people were given a text that described crime as a beast that was preying on the city, kind of like a monster. And in the second one, they were given a text, and in it, crime was described as a virus that had infected that city. And the interesting thing was that the exposure to either of those metaphors had a greater effect on the participants than Democratic and Republican leanings that they had. So those who were given the beast metaphor, they were much more likely to suggest punitive measures to react to the crime. So they talked about prosecuting criminals, using harsher enforcement laws, while those who were exposed to the virus said were much more interested in investigating the causes and enacting social reform, eradicating poverty, improving education. But then actually the most interesting part about the study was that they asked people, so what influenced your answers? And none of them said metaphor. So I think this is super interesting. And you might say again, well, this is closed off conditions. What does metaphor actually make a difference in politics? And here I have an anecdote, recent anecdote, from October 22, when Josep Borrell spoke at the European Diplomatic Academy in Bruges. And there he said, Europe is a garden, the rest of the world is not exactly a garden. Most of the rest of the world is a jungle, and the jungle could invade the garden. And in the days that followed his remarks, Borrell was accused of colonialism, racism, for juxtaposing this kind of civilized European garden with the unruly jungle. And the United Arab Emirates even called in the acting head of mission from the EU and said, "Can you please explain what just Borrell was saying there?" And then Borrell tried to explain himself in a blog post and write the misunderstanding. And he said, well, what he meant by jungle was basically a lawless world, a world of disorder, and the use of force and intimidation and blackmail like Russia was using in Ukraine by invading Ukraine. But I think that episode perfectly captures the potentially far-reaching consequences of kind of a carelessly used metaphor, a metaphor that is neither strategic or persuasive, but leads to misunderstanding and resistance. So, in the words of Francis Ibert, political scientist, and Crystal DeLancer, a professor of communications, metaphors stand at the strategic intersection of language, ideas, and politics. They not only shape how we speak and hear, write and read about politics, but also how we think and feel about politics. And right now, I think we're at a really interesting moment. And this goes back to something we talked about earlier in the lecture, which is we're living in this time of transition, a time when we're trying to find new language to describe the new era we're living in and to understand it and to operate in this new world order or post-Cold War order. And I think it's fair to say we're kind of stuck. As we speak, world leaders are meeting in Davos, and I think this news headline and article is really emblematic of the current discourse. The world is fragmented, it is fractured, it is risk-filled and complex. And this is still kind of the polycrisis mindset that is caught in describing the problem and potentially intensifying feelings of uncertainty and a lack of agency. So I would propose that one might start thinking about alternative frameworks by engaging with metaphor. And this is really where the center of gravity of my doctoral research is what makes effective metaphors. So I have condensed my findings for the last 2 minutes into basically four adjectives to describe effective metaphors. So they are timely. They tap into an existing zeitgeist and relate to everyday lived experience. And this is the idea that metaphors and narratives, you kind of can't invent them at the top somewhere and then simply inject them into a supposedly receptive public. And here we might think of Antonio Gramsci's idea of common sense and how common sense is negotiated in a top-down, bottom-up approach. And it's really this negotiation that leads to a word that sticks or a concept that sticks. And I was thinking of good examples for this, and I think brain rot, which was the word of the year in 2024, is one of those metaphors that I think we all have an emotional or instinctive response to. We know, we have a feeling around that, and we know that we've experienced it as well. Then they are dynamic, and I think this is really important. Effective metaphors encapsulate dynamism and direction, and they imply a certain causal chain and sequence of events. And an example of this would be juxtaposing the two slogans that were used by the Leave and Remain campaign for the Brexit referendum in 2016. So the Leave campaign said, "Take back control," and the Remain campaign said, "Stronger together." And take back control had a verb within it. It was kind of expressing movement and agency, and stronger together was describing a present state and not really offering a future direction. Then they should be relatable. And here, maybe the easiest way to think about it is with the metaphor of falling dominoes from the Cold War. Because dominoes is a game that we all know. You don't have to be an expert in foreign policy to understand the concept of dominoes falling over. We all know it. And then finally, they should be coherent, coherent with the wider context of communication, because communication does not happen in a vacuum. You have to be aware of existing histories, assumptions that you're building on, and kind of networks of discourse that you're tapping into. And I think this is where Borel's jungle metaphor really fell short. So perhaps a different metaphor he could have used would be around an ecosystem or a European ecosystem. So I know that you're not all going to go off and invent new metaphors, although I strongly encourage it. But perhaps something I can leave you with is a greater awareness of and appreciation for the often hidden power of metaphor. And finally, I think I would like us to remind of something that the journalist Walter Lippmann already said more than 100 years ago. And he basically said that for a functioning democracy, there needs to be a degree of shared understanding and a shared basis of facts. And because the world is so complex, and he even said that in 1922, the world was already complex in 1922, and we experience most of it vicariously, so through representations in the media, the models and metaphors we use to make sense of it play a crucial role. They offer interpretations where there's uncertainty, they create emotional resonances, and they kind of make us care about an issue. But in the end, they are also a double-edged sword. They can inspire more productive understandings and visions, but they can also mislead and skew the debate. And I think we can see the latter playing out in societies that have become increasingly polarized, splintering into echo chambers and filter bubbles and lacking that shared basis of understanding. But I think by being curious about narratives and metaphors that are finding persuasive appeal, and by figuring out what grievances and emotions disinformation, for example, builds on, rather than simply dismissing it, we can avoid unwittingly amplifying certain narratives and ideally set the terms of the debate. So what can any of us do in practice? I think if you already are in policymaking or you are going to end up working in policymaking, it is really about cultivating that strategic communications understanding, the awareness that communication shouldn't be an afterthought, but kind of integral to everything you're doing. And it's also about not getting too detached within kind of a bubble from the experience of society and individuals within it. But I also realized that many of you are already in academia or might want to stay in academia, and here I would say that strategic communications and related fields of narratives and metaphors offer a very rich body of research to explore and link into. And it's a highly interdisciplinary field, so my colleagues at King's College studied everything from trust to nostalgia, empathy, music, and even how city planning communicates strategically. And if any of you are interested in pursuing that further or continuing the conversation, I'm very happy to share my details with Markus. So with that, I conclude the lecture part of tonight, and I very much look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
So Leonie, many thanks. And I think I've switched my phone on again. Leonie, thanks a lot for a great talk. And we can ask her all kinds of questions now, yeah? So you can ask her questions more on the conceptual, theoretical side. We can also ask her questions about very much on the applied side, perhaps about metaphors that we could invent using those 4 guidelines about our times. So feel free. And at this juncture, actually, I forgot that beforehand. I wanted to say a special welcome to our students, so to Johannes' students from Brazil, from Brasilia, as I understand. I think there are 8 of you here. And thanks a lot for coming, and feel free to dig into the discussion. Okay, so we're always gonna do 3 questions at a time, anticipating that there will be a lively debate. So whenever you wanna ask something, raise your hand, and then let's start with Eric. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Erik Alholm. I'm a student from Finland. And my question concerns, in terms of communication by US President Trump, do you see his way of communicating as strategic communication or more as ad hoc communication? Thank you.
That's a very good one and a very timely one. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Harvey Zoden, a former vice president of ABC Television. If we could get practical for a second, and maybe the flip side to the first question. If you were a strategic communicator from the EU, what message and what metaphors would you use to both the Trump administration and to the American public, given what's going on in the last few days? Thanks.
Harvey, many thanks. And yes.
Hi, I'm Jacob. I'm a student here. You talked early in your lecture about knowing your audience and understanding your audience. So how do you, when you're issuing a communication, research your audience and understand where they're coming from?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. Leonie, those were 3.
Yeah. So I will begin with the last question, which is around kind of the method around understanding audiences. And this is basically target audience analysis. And I don't do that, but I know that, you know, when I worked in the UK, it was something UK government and also private strategic communications companies do, and essentially it's through surveys and interviews. But then I also think, and people on the ground, so it's important to have those networks on the ground, and I think that was a big learning for communicating also in crisis regions. So basically target audience analysis, and of course, if you have access to it, using big data. But I think there we're also we are in front of like an ethical problem because if we basically create an environment where we micro-target, and this is what's happening, we're splintering up the public and public opinion and working against that shared understanding. So a lot of ethics involved in there as well. To the 2 questions around the US and whether President Trump communicates strategically or ad hoc, I think there is a level of strategy to it. I think it's often hard to assess whether it would count as strategic communications in the moment. We have to kind of look in hindsight about whether it is shifting discourses. But I would say, as I'm thinking out loud now, it has shifted the discourse, and it's also having knock-on effects on other countries and political figures there who are taking up that discourse and that language and that maybe much more brusque way of expressing oneself. And then a metaphor for the EU. I think it would be around, so I think coming up with good metaphors is really hard work. I think you really need to sit down and debate it through, but I think aspects of that would be expressing resilience and strength on behalf of the EU, and also tapping into this transatlantic ideas, which are really, I think, what is threatened right now, the idea of a strong transatlantic community and a rules-based order, kind of the certain basic principles and values that we've shared and that have been cultivated after the Second World War. I think that would be something that might be useful to tap into. But I think, again, strategic metaphors need a lot of careful thinking. So, yeah.
Thanks very much. So we can move on to the next batch. Don't even know where to start anymore. I neglected this side in the first round, so let's go over there. Maybe Sean first, and then to the front.
Hi, my name's Sean. I'm a student here as well. I'm from Canada. And my question is, how do you effectively communicate against like dog whistles and when opposition are using like selective targeting for their advertisement campaigns? An example being like recently they were using Snapchat advertisements in the US to target specifically based on like neighborhoods, and so they would be doing like a pro-Palestinian thing in Muslim areas, and then they'd be doing like pro Gaza things in Jewish neighborhoods? And again, onto dog whistling, how do you effectively counter when people don't understand what's necessarily being said?
Thank you. And yes.
Hello, my name is Nike. I'm a Master 2 student here at the DA. So at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned this inflationary use of words like crisis and war in current debates. And I was wondering if this dramatic language and panic-inducing narrative is failing to stimulate the proactive response from governments or policymakers. Why is it that it's still being used as the standard mode of communication? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, my name is Fiona and I'm a master's student here as well. I have a question regarding your data that you use during your work, because you said you work a lot with discourse analysis, which I find really interesting. So I can imagine that you're working with a lot of new data sets nowadays, from official government sources to social media even. So I was wondering, from the geopolitical perspective, which types of data are the most transformative? Thank you.
Thank you. And then Leonie, word to you again.
So to the first question, I think that is basically about, and it taps into a bigger conundrum or challenge for communications, which is essentially, do we mirror the methods that we believe are actually harmful because they are effective, or where do we stand ethically on that? So I think a basic principle of strategic communications, and here we get into a whole debate of how is strategic communications different from manipulation or propaganda, which is something that is frequently launched at strategic communications. Like, how do you distinguish yourself? And we spent a lot of time debating that, and in the end came to the conclusion that strategic communications is based on certain principles that actually want to support lively debate and this contested environment. Even though it makes communications harder, it's harder to get my message across if I allow for that, but strategic communications needs to allow a certain level of freedom of expression, choice between different ideas, and an ability to hold people accountable as well. So I think simply responding with the same methods would not be a good idea. It is a much more probably long-term approach to think about how do you foster a healthy information environment. And here being mindful as well that the information technologies that we're using, they are not based on a logic that is about establishing a positive infrastructure to communicate that fosters democracy. They're based on profit models that want to keep us on the platform for as long as possible. So the heuristics they tap into, the kind of system one thinking that they inspire, is going to be highly emotional and wanting to keep us on that platform for as long as possible. So I think it is about that bigger question of how can we make sure that we have communication platforms that are actually productive for democracy. Then the second question around the continuing appeal of these crisis and war metaphors. And I think you're absolutely right that it's a really good observation. Creating a sense of crisis and urgency is a way to make people act and might seem like a very useful tactical response, but it doesn't get people excited. It doesn't, create a vision for actually keeping us engaged for a longer time. And I think that is something we've seen play out with climate change. It's a very crisis-ridden discourse. It's quite negative, and rightfully so. But in the end, you kind of tap out from it after a while because you have so many other things you're thinking about in your everyday life. So I think that is a key challenge, and it's about, essentially finding something positive, but without seeming naive and kind of downplaying the issue. But it's that tension that I think we have to navigate. And around discourse analysis and data sets. So for my own research, as you mentioned as well, I used discourse analysis, but it was a kind of manual. Well, some of it was using big corpus data sets of of English language, but a lot of it was manual research in archives and actually sifting through, because the challenge, if you're looking at metaphor, basically, so if you're just looking for keywords, you can use data sets, you can type them in, you can find them, and you can create webs and so on. With metaphor, it's a bit more challenging because metaphors are expressed not just with one word. So with containment and the Cold War, it was, I could have looked for the word containment, but when containment was actually being used as a metaphor, maybe they were talking about a flood of communism rolling over, or a bulwark, or communism as a virus. So there were so many related words and concepts that I had to look for that I basically could only do it by actually manually sifting through for most of it. So qualitative research in the end. Yeah, so I hope that answered those questions.
Thank you. And I neglected this side, so let's move on. Yes, please.
Yes, hi. My name is Jeff Manners. I'm a retired insurance executive. My question relates to how do you foster constructive dialogue? It seems like with creating metaphors, we're broadcasting our point of view, our view, but no one is omniscient, no one's infallible. The other side, we might not be completely right. More often than not, I'm not. My wife tells me that. So how do you leave a door open? How do you get it to the next step where it becomes constructive exchange of ideas and not painting the other side into a corner where they feel they have to fight back?
Thank you. And then, yes, please.
Good evening. Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. My name is Ksenia. I'm a second-year master's student here at the Academy, and I would like to ask you a couple of questions regarding geopolitics in our current times. So first, what are the biggest challenges when engaging with states that have non-democratic regimes or totalitarian ideologies? Like, for instance, how can the European Union improve its communication strategies and policies as well regarding countries like North Korea or Russia? And second, do you believe that current international sanctions on such countries help improve current Eastern geopolitical circumstances, or could they actually backfire by making our efforts less effective? Thank you.
Thank you. And then we have room for one more, maybe in the back. Yes.
My name is Leah Lemmacher. I'm a second-year MI student, and I was wondering, given the rise of hybrid warfare tactics and disinformation campaigns, how can strategic communication be used to effectively manage and combat these threats? And how can strategic communication be used to advocate for transparency in international diplomacy?
Thank you, Leonie.
Okay, so $1 million question of how to foster constructive dialogue and exchange of ideas. I think one thing to focus on is actually plain analog communications with people. So the exchanges that I mentioned in this kind of second ring of social relations, so the random conversations you have with people on the train or on the street or at the bakery. But I think that is one element of it. We're very focused on digital communications all the time, and I was as well in my talk. But I think sometimes we take that to represent the entirety of human experience. And in reality, we are on our phones, but we're also experiencing an information environment that is just us walking down the street, feeling the pavement below our feet, smelling something somewhere, hearing a sound, right? So I think getting out of that sense of it's all just on Twitter and we're all angry and just texting each other on it, I think moving above that. But I think an observation that I have on that as well is really the ability to have meaningful discussions on an intellectual and level where we don't immediately go into personal accusations, because I think part of the challenge with social media is that we have this complete mix of information. We have political information, but we're also finding out about our friends, a new recipe, something that makes us laugh, something that makes us cry. So we don't really see information and politics as something separate. It's not we sit down and we open the politics section in our newspaper. So I think that's also changed the way we engage with information, and it's something that I think would be very interesting to pursue in terms of research as well. How has that actually changed how we relate to political information? And, because all of that seems so interwoven and intermixed today. The biggest challenges in communicating with authoritarian regimes, and to your sanctions questions, I'm not really a sanctions expert, so I wouldn't want to comment on that. But I think focusing on communications internally is very important as well. So for the EU or any Western democracy, it's also about talking about these challenges within this crisis of confidence. I think it starts there. It's about telling that story and going back to the roots. Why do we live by these liberal democratic principles? Maybe we have to go back and explain them again. We can't just kind of sit back and say, oh, everyone understands what democracy is. Everyone understands what individual freedoms are. So I think perhaps interrogating that and spelling it out again. Strategic communications versus disinformation. So part of my work at King's was also engaging with the topic of fake news when it came up as a term in 2016, 2017. And I think basically since then we've been very engaged with disinformation as kind of the main challenge when it comes to communication, and we're thinking of how to counter it and how to understand these networks and its spread, and that's all interesting, but I think if we just think about it on that level, we stay reactive. And if we want to truly combat disinformation, we shouldn't respond to every piece of disinformation we see. And sometimes ignoring it might be better than fact-checking it. Because once the information is out there, basically even if you're denying it, because of the way our human brains work, it will just reinforce that initial message. And the UK government did something quite interesting, and this is a practical example, when the Skripal poisoning happened, and there were tons of Russian disinformation stories, or probably originating from Russia, coming in about what had happened in that poisoning case in Salisbury. And the UK government didn't respond to each of them, but they basically came out and said, so there are all these disinformation stories. Russia released 75 different disinformation stories. And so clearly they can't all be true because they're contradictory and telling you different things. So they didn't react individually, but they were making a larger comment about the methods. So I think that's one quite useful and interesting way to react to it. Yeah.
Thank you. And then let's do one more round, and if need be, it's going to be more than 3. But I think we are okay.
My name is Anna, I'm also a student here. I was wondering about measuring the effectiveness of strategic communication, particularly on a geopolitical level. So how can we measure this effectiveness ultimately to improve strategic communication, and also what might be the limits of this measurement?
Thank you. Yes. In the back, yeah.
Thank you for the very interesting presentation. My name is Christina. I'm a business student. And is it right that there is, do I sense it right that there's a change in the nature and the purpose of the strategic communication? It used to be in the past, coming to geopolitics, that our values are superior to the others. But nowadays, it's rather about what I'm doing is bad, but what the other is doing is even worse. So it's rather about discrediting the other and not representing or showing off that our values and what we are doing is actually morally or ethically better than what the other is. Thank you.
Thank you. And then I think Marima, yeah.
My name is Marima. I am also a MICE2 student. I wanted to ask, when big corporations control the infrastructure of information, how do governments make sure that they don't lose control of the ability to communicate strategically in this space? Thank you.
Okay. And Kaza, you also wanted to say something. Yeah, then the last one. Okay.
Hello, my name is Kusai. I'm just interested in finding what is now being highlighted as a strategic communication. For example, I've been following all of the speeches and interviews coming out from Davos yesterday, and even the president of the World Economic Forum in Davos said that he expects the next 4 years to be about cooperation. And while the expert that you've chosen from Reuters is actually focusing on negative outcomes. So how can we deal what is being communicated and what is being highlighted? Why we didn't see anything from the positive word that was cooperation? Even the president of Siemens said that this is going to be about self-confidence. And but now we see all of the news this morning focusing on the destruction that is coming. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I have at some if it's very brief, okay? Yeah? It's very brief. Okay. We just need the microphone because otherwise the online audience they can't hear you.
Hi, my name is Maria Eduarda. I'm a student from Professor Johannes, and I was just wondering is there a distinct approach to strategic communications in post-colonial countries like Brazil compared to traditional global powers? How can such an approach be most productive and strengthening democracy, particularly in terms of fostering informed public discourse and civic engagement? That is my question.
Thank you. So there are quite a lot of normative questions, which I like. That's good. And I think and that's okay. Yeah. Then Leonie, sorry, I'm gonna add three little questions as well, because I'm interested. I know that's very selfish.
Now it's gonna get
because
challenging.
No. So the first one is about emotions. So in order for metaphors to stick, do we actually have to appeal to emotions? Is that and if that's the case, is it more kind of negative or more the kind of positive emotions that work? I don't know whether you have any findings about that. The second one, I thought your sort of basically the 4 criteria for how to let's say design metaphors, they made a lot of sense to me. The second one was dynamic. And what does dynamic actually mean in our times? So is it still possible that something like containment that stuck for many decades, yeah, through an entire era basically. Is something like that still possible, or is the communicative landscape so fragmented by now? And and everything's so short-lived that something like that is unlikely to happen again. And my third question is metaphors and historical analogies. How do they hang together? So can we apply a lot of things that you said to historical analogies as well, or not? So one historic analogy that is floating around at the moment quite strongly is the new Cold War, for instance, right? That's probably not a metaphor. I mean, depends on how you define it, but a historical analogy, so does it work similarly with these historical analogies? Is it a different ball game? And there were lots of questions now, so feel free to pick and choose.
Sum it up, but I think so. With the historical analogies, so Cold War is a metaphor as well. Right?
Yes, so it's basically a metaphor.
A word that we've taken and
historical analogy, yeah.
Yeah. So, and in that case, it is kind of, I think, a dead metaphor, because we don't think of cold when we think of Cold War. We think of the historical period. So that's an interesting kind of concept in metaphor theory as well, is the idea of dead metaphors. Like we talk about the leg of a table, and there's no other word to describe this than leg of a table, but it's actually a metaphor. But we don't think of human legs when we hear that. So I think historical analogy often acts similarly because there is that discourse it builds into, there is emotional resonance, as you say, and there's what metaphor often does is it gives you a kind of condensed logic or narrative. And I think a historical analogy basically does that. So when we say Cold War, immediately we're, okay, superpower conflict, two blocks, high stakes maybe, and maybe less actual kind of hot war in it, right? So that I think emotions almost always play some kind of role in metaphors and in effective metaphors. But they can be quite subtle. So I think with containment, and that was what was really interesting with that metaphor, is it basically talked about preventing something that was frightening, but in quite a calm and collected way. It was very much, we're not the aggressor, we're simply containing. It's like the idea of containing a virus. There's a very simple logic to it. But in the end, it is also about establishing control. And I think control is actually a key word as well, in addition to emotion. So metaphors are often used in times of uncertainty when we kind of are struggling to make sense of a situation, and containment gave a sense of, I understand what is going on, and hence I have a level of control over it. And what I found in my studies was that control, basically normal people on the ground who were just living their lives in like the suburbs, 1950s US, they were given a sense of control when they were handed the manual that said, this is how you respond to nuclear threat, and it's actually very simple. You just hide in your bunker, you have your first aid kit ready, and you don't have to worry because there are steps you can take. And I think it is drawing that connection between steps that individuals can take and giving them a sense of agency. So that also builds into the idea of dynamic metaphors and how they would look like today. And I think you touch on an interesting question, which is if, as we talked about Andreas Reckwitz, this idea of progress is kind of come under stress. What does this direction look like? And if we're talking about, because we're essentially talking about maintaining institutions and orders right now, that is kind of the main conceptual image, I think. It is keeping foundations stable. It is preventing a world from splintering. But that is, again, it feels reactive. It is not really moving towards something, maybe a bigger goal. And I think here it is interesting to look at President Carter and how he spoke about a world that he very much perceived as being complex. And I would say that he, in a way, was the first post-Cold War president, even though he was very much in the Cold War. But in terms of how he was speaking, he really wanted to introduce these ideas of complexity, actually, and of a networked global society into his language. And it was quite short-lived when he tried to do that. But I think it's worth going back and studying that, because I think if we want to capture the times we live in, we need to kind of negotiate that underlying tension of our mindsets, and the metaphors and narratives we've inherited are very much based on a structural view of the world where nation states are these independent containers and we can separate them into blocks, and we're not actually as connected as we are. But the truth is we are very connected, and that's where Cold War metaphors fall short, because the situation is very different. We have dependencies, we have a globally connected information system. So negotiating that, I think, is a key challenge. And we might not be able to speak about complexity, but maybe we can amend kind of this idea of in-groups and out-groups, which essentially is containment, to be more fluid and more open. So I'm just looking through if there... I think brief note on measurement of effect, because this is like a key question in communications, and it's not something we can fully resolve like on a grand scale, because it's very hard to control the variables you're looking at. We don't know that something caused someone to behave or react differently. We can kind of just measure the general sense of that. And I think it's easier to do that if in specific communications projects that are kind of more on the ground and not on a global scale. I think there it is something we study in hindsight. So studying containment as a key metaphor, I don't think if someone had said in 1955, I think containment is going to be the key metaphor, or has been the key metaphor for the past 15 years, maybe. But it's much easier to study that in hindsight on the geopolitical level, I think. And the comment at the back, or comment/question around media representation of Davos, I think that perfectly captures like how our information environment works. It's if the dominant narrative that is sticking is this idea of a much more negative, like fragmenting, fracturing, and the other kind of ideas are not being heard, that simply shows that it's not enough to just go up and give a speech. You really have to think about where it goes, and maybe you are really trying very hard to get your message placed, but it's simply not arriving. And I think it's also living with that, essentially, that you're not going to be successful in communications a lot of the time, and there's a lot of trial and error, and you've got to be open and flexible with that, because you can't control communications. At the most, you can try and shape and shift and kind of guide these flows of communication if you're lucky.
Leonie, thanks a lot. So it was a fascinating talk, I think, and discussion. So we learned about jungles and about gardens and about legs of tables. And I think you made a very convincing case that it actually really matters for world politics in the past, today, and in the future. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.